Yeah. Good afternoon. So I'm actually very excited to be here for two things, right? One is reacquaint with many of you that I've met before, and the second thing is we do have one of the largest labs in IBM here in Fredericton, right? So I'm excited to see the team as well. So first of all, thank you, Ali, CIC, and UNB for having me here. Today, I'm going to spend a little bit of time in modernizing security, right? So I think we have a wrong presentation. That's okay. So I'm going to talk about it anyway. We don't need slides. So one of the things that I'm very excited is I've been in the security industry for almost 25, 26 years. Security has always been an afterthought, right? It's always been an afterthought in terms of how do we basically look at security as after the fact of innovation or transformation. And what excites me is the fact that as we're doing a lot of transformations, security is becoming a topic of conversations, whether you're modernizing applications or whether you're modernizing data or moving workloads to take advantage of the right infrastructure. Security is becoming a topic of conversation. You heard that from Sandy as well. But the reality is that there are capabilities that are provided across the board. So there's too many products that don't necessarily talk to each other. There's too much of data. And then you've heard from the panel earlier on that we don't have the right skills to be able to bring it all together, right? So there we go. So I think that's good. Thank you. So we don't have the skills to bring it all together, right? As a result, we do see our adversaries taking advantage of those seams and continue to make an impact, right? And the cost of breach continues to go up. So we do need a mechanism to modernize security, right? And because the current systems are not working, for the new level of innovations that we're doing. It's very similar to thinking about a house, right? You've got a house from 1950s, 60s, in a great foundation, etc. But as you live in the 21st century, you may have to look at, modernizing to a certain extent, right? The plumbing may be different, the electrical circuit may be different. It's just bringing up to code. And one way that most organizations are looking at modernization is around zero trust principles, right? The idea over here is that perimeter is no longer sufficient to be able to deliver the full security, especially when the sharks are already in the water, right? You have to figure out how to defend on a man-to-man basis, right? Or the person-to-person basis. So zero trust is a philosophy or a set of principles that basically say, hey, you need a need-to-know basis, right? What we call least privilege, right? Making sure that you provide access only on a need-to-know basis, but that alone is not sufficient. You may have to continuously verify that access, and you always assume a state of breach. So you're constantly monitoring so that if something goes bad, you're able to quickly remediate. No, easier said than done, right? These are principles, sort of practices. There's no one size fits all per se. It requires organizations to take a bit of a cultural shift, right? Have a mindset that will enforce these policies, go from a bit of an implicit trust to adaptive trust, right? Where you're building the trust over a period of time. Especially, for the previous presentation, as you think about things like verifiable credentials, how do you take these claims and continue to build trust versus taking an authentication token and completely implicitly providing access? So it's very similar to going back to my analogy of the house, right? It's about, making sure that as your house grows up into bigger, maybe the foundation is okay, maybe it's not okay. how do you start thinking about certain philosophies, certain principles, so that you're doing a lot more adaptive security. Now, one philosophy, and one of the key things that I do want to mention over here is that this has been around for a while, but it's getting a lot more traction in the industry, and organizations which have adopted these principles are seeing the value, right? They're seeing the value in terms of reducing the cost of that breach, because you're allowing the different capabilities to come together. So that's a real value in terms of how do you make a case for especially some of the organizations over here to go back to the board and talk about reducing that risk. We talked about, zero trust is not a product, right? It's a set of, principles and philosophy that needs to come together. And even if you paint a picture of a number of different domains, these are the capabilities that provide a set of features that solve the principles that we're talking about. Just a mapping as a back of your hand, basically. Now, so now that we understand that there's a need for modernization, right? How do we go about it? We've seen a number of different strategies from organizations, right? A strategy which is a domain or a technology-based strategy, which is, let's take a specific domain like identity or data or network, and then try to modernize it, right? Or in other cases, taking a more of an architectural approach, right? Most of you in the university, you've seen the NIST publication on zero trust, right? PDP, PEP, PIP, etc. Right? That's more of an architectural approach. That's a different way to solve this problem. Many organizations are taking more of an outcome-based approach, right? So there's no one size fits all. There's nothing right or wrong over here. The best analogy mapping back to my house analogy is to say that if you do have an old house and you have aluminum, wiring, one option is to go and change the entire wiring of the house. Is it possible? Absolutely. That's one way of thinking about it, right? But sometimes it can be difficult when you're living in that house, right? You may have to, put food on the table. Another approach is to basically say that, let me take a room by room approach, which is, let's go ahead and modernize my office or the bedroom or the bathroom. And as you're doing that, let's change the plumbing. Let's go change the ducting. Let's make sure they have the right fixtures, right? And then show the value that, okay, now you have something which is usable, and then keep extending it. So these are different philosophies of how organizations are approaching it. I'm sharing so that this may spark an idea for some of you in terms of how do you get started in this journey, right? Most organizations that we work with a number of clients across the world, global clients. They're taking a mixed approach, which is a outcome-based approach, right? Primarily because you got to keep the lights on, right? Making sure that, translating to the technology or my house analogy, sometimes it's difficult to go and replace the entire data security or replace the entire identity fabric overnight, right? Without impacting some of the business. So taking a little bit more of an outcome-based approach to basically say, let me go and figure out how to deal with ransomware and do it in a manner that I can improve the cyber resiliency posture, right? Going back to the conversation earlier today, right? Some are basically saying, most of my organization is working from home. Let me go and fix my remote or hybrid access capabilities, right? Instead of going through a VPN, you may want to go and authenticate first and get network access, versus today, we tend to do network and then authenticate with things like, SASE, etc. Another outcome that we see quite often is around hybrid cloud, right? Which is as organizations are modernizing, data is being moved. So how do you protect that data, right? So you can see some of the outcomes over here in terms of how organizations are getting started on this journey. So that's more of a what, right? And how they're getting started, right? What we've done is to basically accelerate this. The whole point over here is that, security, as we all agree, is a world problem. It's not a geo problem. It's not a Canada problem. It's not a vendor problem, but it's a world problem. And we got to figure out how do we go and, come together as a community to be able to get started on these kind of initiatives that require not just one organization, one vendor, but multiple entities to work together. So this is a simple framework we kind of used, of course, simplified for conversation over here, to basically take those principles, right? Least privilege or continuous verification or assumption of breach, and then map it to those domains, whether it's identity, whether it's data, whether it is network, whether it's application, so that now as you're taking an outcome, in my analogy, that room, right? As you're taking that one room and you're modernizing it, you can now say, hey, I need these 3 features in identity. I need these 4 features in data. I need these 8 features in threat to come together. And the chances are that you may have some of them already, right? So that gives a very simple approach of how do we get started and go on that journey. And here's an example, right? Here's an example of a blueprint. And there's a whole bunch of blueprints in terms of how you put that to a practical use, right? If you think about a very simple, ransomware, or being able to do a better job of responding to ransomware, it starts with preparing, right? Being able to do a good job of protecting and backing up with boundary controls and air gaps, etc., and then be able to detect very quickly if something bad happens, and then using playbooks as a way to go and remediate that and in a safe manner, right? Mouthful when I say all of those things, but when you lay down on paper and we laid out in principles, what you see on the right-hand side is a more granular rendition of that you can start, solving at least some of those use cases. Now, in general, we've learned a lot. We've learned a lot from many deployments across the world, right? And many engagements across the world. Just taking a sample of about 100-ish, just this year. Mind you, these are mostly global companies. It's easy to go started with a SaaS-based offering or do something what we call greenfield. It becomes tough when you have heritage, sometimes called legacy, right? This is something we often get. Most clients are basically saying that, Sridhar, this makes sense, absolutely, but we do have a lot of heritage. We can't just get rid of it. How do I bring that along, right? My pipes from 1950, my aluminum wiring or steel ducting. It takes effort to integrate those. There's also concern about how do you do a better job of mapping back to the overall risk. We talked about cybersecurity being one of the top topics of board, right? So how do you take something like zero trust and map it back to the risk so that it becomes something that you're investing in? The other thing which comes up quite often is the conflict between the day job of trying to do what is right for the business, as well as something like zero trust is more of a journey, right? That takes incremental enhancements to basically bring it together. So it's a conflict between what you need to do for the business as well as keeping lights and the long-term things. Those are some of the things that we hear. But what we learned could potentially help a lot of these things, right? The first thing is that a lot of these things revolve around risk, right? Whether it is building a strategy for zero trust or building a implementation, it's about how do you minimize that risk? So it starts with estimation of that risk. I think somebody asked a question earlier today. It's about understanding the vulnerabilities, it's understanding the threat landscape, understanding the weaponization, meaning how easy it is to attack something, understanding the business context, right? Bringing it together in a manner that then maps back to an organization's risk and be able to minimize that, right? That helps in conversations. That helps in conversations to say, hey, if you do this, I'm able to minimize this risk and quantify that as well. One of the technologies which comes up quite often in that is asset repository, right? Very hard, Sandy talked about CMDB, it's one aspect of it, but being able to understand this attack surface that we're talking about, right? Which is growing on a regular basis, not only in the breadth, but also in the depth, right? So investing in that seems to go a long way in terms of addressing some of these strategic initiatives. Second thing is, we talked about these balance between keeping the lights on of day job versus strategic approaches, right? The best approach that we've seen work is having a long-term focus, but a short-term value, right? So driving a long-term project is important, but also show the value in the short term, right? Going back to that hybrid cloud or hybrid workforce, most of us work from home. So if you enable something like moving from VPN to something like SASE, it helps you quickly get access instead of having a heavy infrastructure, as an example, right? Something which is low-hanging fruit. That seems to help. The other one is cloud. Everybody is moving to some way, shape, and form of hybrid and multi-cloud deployment, right? So leverage that, embrace that. And the analogy that I give over here is get on a train which is moving versus starting a new train, right? Where instead of basically saying, hey, I need budget for zero trust, being able to say that I've got a project on cloud, I've got a project on something else, as you're doing that project, if you bake in these principles, that seems to work a lot better than trying to start a new train. In general, I think we see, three things which for a successful zero trust project, right? One is having that governance of a strategic initiative, having a program which is able to have the architecture and the governance to drive long-term projects, right? Most of the organization tend to spend time on what is immediate value, but having that governance is important, right? Second thing is that transformation initiative that I talked about. If something is moving, if a train is moving, get on that train versus trying to start a new train. That seems to help big time, right? And the last one is the technology itself, the innovation itself, right? Whether it is we use the hybrid remote workforce, and we talked about SASE, could be adaptive access, right? Where we're basically seeing that in many deployments, as they're embracing adaptive access, a decrease in multi-factor authentication, right? I'm working with the financial institution. They've started with 14% on multi-factor authentication. When we decrease it to 4% based on, an analytics, you're able to see an increase of 30% of customer interactions. Got to find those things to be able to move the train over here. The last point I want to make is, this is a great crowd, right? You've got university, you've got government, you've got my fellow vendors, and you've got a number of different personas over here, right? I go back to my point earlier on, security being a world problem, right? And one way to be able to go and address the attacks that we're seeing is to come together to a certain extent and leverage some of these modernization principles, right? So embrace zero trust. If you're an organization or a client, hopefully some of these will help you get started. Shared some of the best practices as well as blueprints and field guides for you to get some ideas. If you are a vendor or if you're working with a number of different initiatives, embrace open, right? Like I said earlier on, there's too many tools that don't necessarily talk to each other. And leveraging that open, and the session after this is also focused on that, will help move the needle faster, right? And the folks who are doing research, and take a look at some of the automation. How do you get this done faster, right? How do you leverage these patterns? How do you put AI and automation in a manner that these becomes repeatable patterns versus every client having to do on its own, basically? So with that, I want to thank for my time over here and here for questions. Yeah, I can hear you.
Hi, my name is Ayanika, and I'm a grad student at UNB. And we actually presented a poster on zero trust. So this is quite an interesting topic to be, listening to right now. And you touched upon how legacy systems are sort of hard to upgrade to a zero trust architecture. So do you have any strategies? Because even in our architecture, that's one of the problems that we are anticipating to have.
There's no one size that basically is a silver bullet for all the legacy platforms, right? But you do have to take advantage of different approaches, right? One of the examples that we have done is most of the industry still runs on mainframes, like whether it is airline reservations or banking and things like that. So a good example could be like, proxying is an option, right? So what we did was we created a SAF exit, right, in mainframe. So as a transaction is coming in, you still don't mess with the backend, but be able to intercept that and say, you know what, this is a real user, but look at the context of the application. And then you may want to challenge them and validate that trust and rebuild that, right? That's an example. The other one is basically able to go and provide in a validation before you get to some of the heritage systems or the legacy systems. APIs is another way to implement these. So we have to look at a mechanism to go and safeguard. I wouldn't say ring fence it per se, but provide the right context, right? Legacy systems are not bad. The problem is that they're meant for certain things. Like, for example, airline reservations or credit scoring systems and things like that. We are taking that right now and expanding it and putting in the internet. They are never meant to be that, right? So insulating from that and providing the right context would help leverage them faster, basically. Great, thank you.